The winter of 1878 nearly swallowed the town of Harrow Creek whole, and it would have taken little Clara Bishop right along with it if not for the quiet, stubborn kindness of a woman. Most of the town had already written off as too sad to be of use to anyone. Harrow Creek sat in the southeast corner of Wyoming Territory, pressed between red sandstone bluffs and a shallow creek that froze solid by November and didn't thaw until April made its reluctant appearance. It was a cattle and railroad town, the kind of place where men worked themselves to bone and sinew, and women either hardened alongside them or broke entirely. The wind that came down off the Laramie Range in December had a particular cruelty to it, the kind that slipped under door frames and found the spaces between quilt panels with an almost personal malice. Thomas Bishop had been riding that cruelty for 3 years by the time the worst winter in a decade arrived. He was 34 years old, broad through the shoulders, with hands so calloused from fence wire and saddle leather that he could barely feel the difference between a warm coal stove and a cold iron pump handle. He had dark hair that had started going silver at the temples after his wife Margaret died, and gray eyes that people in town described as handsome when he wasn't around and haunted when he was. He ran the Bishop cattle operation 7 miles south of Harrow Creek with a kind of grinding determination that left no room for sentiment, no room for weakness, and precious little room for the 3 daughters he had brought into the world with Margaret before a fever took her in the spring of 1875. His eldest, Ruth, was 12 going on 40. She cooked and sewed and kept the house in the relentless, joyless way that a child does when grief has handed her adult responsibilities before she has finished losing her baby teeth. His middle daughter, Ada, was 9 and had her mother's round face and her father's stubborn streak, which meant she was in a perpetual war with everyone around her and somehow always right about things that didn't help anyone. And then there was Clara, who was 5 years old and had arrived in the world so small and so determined that the doctor had shaken his head and Margaret had laughed and said she would outlast them all. Clara had her mother's dark lashes and a cough that had followed her since birth like an uninvited companion, the kind of cough that worried everyone who heard it and kept Thomas up on cold nights listening through the thin wall between his room and the girls'. The trouble began in October of 1878 when Thomas rode north with his ranch hand Burl Mackey to help with a cattle drive that had come up short on men. He expected to be gone 3 weeks. He was gone for 11. It was not entirely his fault. A blizzard trapped the drive in the Powder River country for 2 weeks before they could push the herd south again, and then the creek crossings were dangerous and slow. And then one of the buyer's men broke his leg and needed carrying the last 40 miles to Cheyenne. And Thomas Bishop was the kind of man who could not look at a broken thing and ride past it. By the time he and Burl came back through the pass south of Harrow Creek, it was the first week of January, and the temperature had dropped so far that the air itself seemed offended by the intrusion of living things moving through it. He rode hard for home, telling himself the girls were fine, that Ruth was capable, that he had left them enough flour and salt pork and dried beans to last through February. He had left them firewood stacked to the eaves of the porch. He had arranged with his nearest neighbor, a grizzled cattleman named Holt Briggs who lived 4 miles to the east, to check on them every 10 days or so. He told himself all of this and urged his horse faster anyway, because no amount of reasonable reassurance could entirely silence a father's instinct. What he found when he arrived was not what he expected. The house was warm. Not just survivable warm, but genuinely, luxuriously warm in a way that his pine plank house with its single fireplace and the small cast iron stove in the kitchen never quite managed even when he was home and feeding both fires. There was the smell of something baking, and the windows, which usually ran with ice on the inside by January, were merely fogged. Ruth met him at the door with an expression he couldn't immediately read, somewhere between relief and a guilt she was clearly trying to hide, and Ada came tumbling out behind her with a piece of cornbread in her fist and crumbs down the front of her dress. "Papa," Ruth said carefully, "where is Clara?" He asked because Clara was always the first one to the door, coughing and laughing and reaching for him. "She is sleeping," Ruth said. "She has been sleeping well. She is much better." He went inside and stopped. His kitchen, which he had left in the organized sparseness of a man who ran a household like a necessary chore, had been transformed. There were dried herbs hanging from the ceiling beams, bundles of something dark and fragrant. There was a second quilt on the line near the stove, airing out, one he had never seen before, stitched in a blue and gold pattern that was too fine for anything he owned. There was a rocking chair pulled close to the hearth that was not his rocking chair. And on the kitchen table, next to his own chipped tin cups, sat 2 cups he did not recognize, fine ceramic with a small rose pattern on the handle, thoroughly out of place, and yet somehow making the whole room look more like a home than it had in 3 years. "Ruth," he said slowly, "who has been here?" Ruth's expression completed its journey from careful neutrality into something that looked remarkably like defiance for a 12-year-old. "Mrs. Townsend," she said. "She came in November when the first big snow hit and Clara's chest got bad. She has been coming every day since." Thomas Bishop stood very still in his own kitchen. He knew the name Elsie Townsend. The whole of Harrow Creek knew the name, though most people said it in that particular tone people reserve for someone they feel sorry for but don't quite know what to do with. Elsie Townsend was a widow, had been for going on 2 years. Her husband James had been a decent man, a carpenter and part-time freight hauler, and he had been killed when a wagon wheel shattered on a mountain road and sent the whole loaded rig down a ravine in the autumn of 1876. He had left Elsie their small house on the north end of Harrow Creek's Main Street, a modest savings that she had been stretching with careful domestic work, and no children. That last part was the thing people seemed most inclined to discuss in low voices, as if a woman without children was a subject requiring both pity and a certain delicacy. Thomas had seen her precisely 3 times since she'd arrived in Harrow Creek with James 2 years before his death. Once at a general store, where she had been buying thread and he had been buying boot nails, and they had exchanged the brief nods of strangers. Once at the 4th of July celebration in 1877, where he had watched her from across a field of people and noted, with the distracted attention of a man who notices things the way a horse notices weather, that she had auburn hair and a careful, self-possessed quality to her stillness that was unusual. And once in September of 1878, just before he had left on the drive, when he had passed her on the road south of town, and she had been struggling with a fence post that had come loose from her small garden plot, driving it back into the hard ground with a determination that was slightly too fierce for a woman that slight. He had thought about stopping. He had ridden on. She came every day. He said to Ruth, "Every single day," Ada confirmed, unbothered by any subtext whatsoever. "She brings soup. She knows how to make a mustard poultice for Clara's chest. She taught me how to make cornbread." "The cornbread you are currently wearing," he said. Ada looked down at herself. "Most of it went in my mouth," she said with complete dignity. He looked at the rocking chair, the borrowed cups, the herbs on the ceiling. He looked at the fine quilt airing near the stove. He looked at his daughters, who were warm and fed and, in Ada's case, extremely self-satisfied, and he felt something shift inside his chest that he did not immediately have a name for. It sat somewhere between gratitude so overwhelming it was nearly painful, and a shame so acute it had its own specific gravity. He had left. He had left his children. He had left them with a stockpile of provisions and a neighbor who checked every 10 days and apparently the grace of a woman he barely knew, and the provisions and the neighbor had not been enough but the woman had been. He walked to Clara's room, which was the smallest room in the house, and the one he always made sure was farthest from the outer walls for the insulation. Clara was asleep in her narrow bed, tucked under a quilt he recognized, and also the blue and gold one that matched the pattern he'd seen airing in the kitchen. Her color was good. Her breathing was even and quiet, the particular quiet of a child genuinely at rest rather than exhausted past the point of protest. On the small table beside her bed was a tin of something that smelled of eucalyptus and beeswax. He stood there for a long time with his hand pressed flat against the doorframe. He did not sleep much that night. He lay on his own mattress and stared at the ceiling, and listened to the wind working at the eaves, and thought about what it meant that he had come home to find his youngest daughter breathing easy and smelling of eucalyptus salve under a borrowed quilt, cared for by a woman who had no obligation to her in the world. He thought about the rocking chair and the ceramic cups with the rose pattern. He thought about what it cost a person, in time and effort and in the quiet expenditure of their own emotional reserves, to come to someone else's house every day for months and make sure 3 children were fed and warm and not afraid. He thought about what kind of woman did that. He thought about auburn hair and a fence post being driven into hard autumn ground with fierce, quiet determination. He did not let himself think too far past that, because he was Thomas Bishop, and he had 3 daughters and a cattle operation, and a grief he had been carrying so long it had become part of his posture, and he was not the sort of man who let himself think too far past practical matters. Or so he had believed up until roughly 11 o'clock that night, when he gave up on sleep entirely and went and sat by the kitchen fire and looked at the rocking chair and the ceramic cups and thought about everything anyway. He would go to town in the morning. He would return what was borrowed. He would say thank you in the brief, formal way of a man who did not know how to be anything else, and that would be the end of it. He told himself this with great conviction, and he almost believed it. He set out for Harrow Creek the morning after his return, riding through a cold that had moderated slightly to merely brutal, his horse Drum moving in that short-stepped, unhappy way horses had in temperatures below zero. He had the blue and gold quilt folded and tied behind his saddle, and the rocking chair had been too large to bring on horseback, so he had made a note to bring the wagon when the cold eased. He had the 2 ceramic cups wrapped in cloth in his saddlebag, because he was not a man who kept what wasn't his. Harrow Creek in January was a gray and grudging place. The main street was packed snow that had been churned to the consistency of old gravel by wagon wheels and boot heels. The storefronts had their awnings weighted down with ice. The saloon at the east end of the street had smoke coming from every chimney pipe and piano music leaking through the walls with a kind of desperate gaiety that was somehow worse than silence. The general store, Holt's Dry Goods and Feed, was open and doing what business the cold allowed. A few horses stood at the hitching rails, looking collectively miserable. A dog crossed the street with the focused urgency of a dog that has somewhere specific to be. He found Elsie Townsend's house without difficulty. It was the second house past the feed store on the north end of the main street, a modest but well-kept frame house with smoke rising from its chimney and a front porch that had been recently swept of snow, with a thoroughness that suggested the person doing the sweeping had needed to do something purposeful with their hands. He knocked. There was a pause long enough for him to wonder if she was home, and then the door opened and he saw Elsie Townsend for what felt, despite the 3 previous times, like the first time he had properly looked at her. She was 29 years old, though he would learn that later. She had the kind of face that a portrait painter would have spent considerable time on, not for conventional prettiness alone, though she had that, but for the quality of the eyes, which were a particular shade of amber brown that suggested both warmth and a careful, measuring intelligence. Her auburn hair was pinned up in the practical style of a woman who worked, but several strands had escaped around her face in the way of someone who had been at indoor tasks all morning. She was wearing a dark wool dress with a pale blue collar, and she had flour on one wrist, which she noticed him noticing, and folded away against her skirt with a naturalness that suggested she was neither embarrassed nor performing unconcern. She looked at him. He realized he had been standing on her porch for several seconds without speaking, which was not like him. "Mr. Bishop," she said. Her voice was level and warm in the way of a woman who had decided not to make anything more difficult than it needed to be. "Mrs. Townsend," he said. He cleared his throat. "I have come to return what is yours." He reached back and unstrapped the quilt from his saddle. She looked at the quilt for a moment, and something moved across her face that he couldn't fully read. "You didn't have to ride all the way in for that," she said. "I know it," he said. "I also came to thank you." She leaned her shoulder against the doorframe, neither inviting him in nor closing the door, which he understood as a kind of waiting to see what kind of man showed up on her porch before she made any commitments about what happened next. "Ruth wrote you," he said. It was not a question. "She did," Elsie said. "She told me you'd been delayed by the snow in the north. I was glad to help." "Glad," he repeated, and something in his voice must have conveyed what he actually meant, because she tilted her head slightly. "Come in out of the cold if you want to say the rest of it," she said quietly. "It's too cold for a proper conversation in a doorway." He tied Drum to the porch rail and went inside. Her house was exactly what he should have expected from those borrowed cups and that careful quilt, neat and warm, and possessed of a particular quality of attention in its arrangement. There were books on a shelf that had been built into the wall, more books than he had seen in any private home in Harrow Creek. There was a rag rug on the floor before the hearth in colors that had been chosen rather than merely accumulated. There was a small sketch pinned to the wall above the writing desk that looked like it might be of the mountains to the north, done in careful pencil lines by someone who had spent real time looking at what they were drawing. She went to the kitchen and came back with coffee, and he accepted it because refusing seemed ungracious and because it was very cold and the coffee was very good. He sat in the chair she indicated and she sat across from him, and he looked at his coffee cup for a moment and then looked at her. "You came every day," he said. "Most days," she said simply. "Ruth is a capable girl. She didn't need me to do everything." But Clara's chest needed tending and the cold was very bad this year and I had the time. He looked at her steadily. "You had the time," he said. She met his look without flinching. "Yes. Mrs. Townsend," he said, and stopped and started again. "I left those girls with a good supply and a neighbor on watch, and it wasn't enough. You filled what wasn't enough every day for months without being asked and without my knowledge, and you had no obligation whatsoever to do so. That is not a matter of having time. That is a matter of character." A small silence fell between them. The fire crackled. Outside, the wind pushed at the house in a practiced, routine way. "Clara is a sweet child," Elsie said, and her voice had changed very slightly, softer at the edge. "And Ruth was trying so hard, and Ada was trying so hard to make Ruth's load lighter, in her way, which, as I'm sure you know, involves a great deal of loud opinions and very little actual assistance." The corner of her mouth lifted. "And I have had a quiet winter, and it was good to be useful." He understood, without her saying anything more direct, what kind of quiet winter she had had. 2 years of quiet winters since James Townsend went down a ravine on a mountain road, and no children to break the silence. "That salve on Clara's bedside table," he said. "Eucalyptus and beeswax and a little camphor," she said. "My mother's formula. I made a fresh tin in October when I could see what kind of winter it was going to be. She was breathing evenly last night," he said. "I stood in her doorway and I could hear her breathing easy across the room." Elsie looked at the fire. "I'm glad," she said softly. He looked at her profile in the firelight. There was something about the way she said that, the genuineness of it, the fact that she was clearly not glad in the manner of someone who wanted credit, but in the manner of someone who had been genuinely invested in the outcome, that undid the last of the formal distance he had been maintaining. "I would like to repay you," he said, "in whatever way seems reasonable. I have skills as a carpenter and I can see your front fence needs work." "You don't need to repay me," she said. "I want to," he said, and something in his voice made her look at him directly again. He did not look away. "If you will allow it." She studied him for a moment with those amber-brown eyes, and whatever she found in his gray ones seemed to satisfy some private question because she nodded once, a small, decisive motion. "The fence," she said. "And there is a shutter hinge on the east side that is badly rusted." "I can manage a shutter hinge," he said. "I suspect you can manage most things," she said, and it was said with such uncomplicated matter-of-factness that it took him a moment to understand it was a compliment. He finished his coffee and stood, and she walked him to the door, and on the porch he stopped and turned back. "My daughters," he said, does Ruth know that I am here today?" "I imagined so," Elsie said. "Ruth knows most things." "She did not tell me much about you," he said. "This morning when I asked more about the winter, she told me the basic facts and then got very busy with the breakfast dishes." Elsie's mouth curved fully this time, a real smile, and it was the kind of smile that had warmth behind it all the way through, not a polite surface but something genuine and slightly mischievous. "Perhaps she thought you would find out the rest for yourself," she said. He put his hat back on and stepped off the porch. He had untied Drum and put one foot in the stirrup before he looked back over his shoulder. "I will come about the fence this week," he said. "I'll make coffee," she said. He rode back south through the cold with the empty quilt straps flapping against his saddle, and he was not thinking about the fence. He was thinking about the smile. He came about the fence 3 days later, when the cold had eased a fraction to the merely unpleasant, and he spent 4 hours pulling and resetting posts while Elsie brought coffee out in the mid-morning, and stood on the porch watching him work with the same quality of still attention he had noted the first time he saw her. He fixed the fence and the rusted shutter hinge, and while he was at it, noticed that the woodpile at the side of the house was running low, and spent another hour splitting the seasoned oak logs she had stacked in the small shed, because he could not in good conscience leave a woman alone in January with insufficient firewood and call himself a decent man. She did not protest the extra labor. She came out when she heard the axe and stood watching for a moment and then went back inside, and when he came in afterward she had made soup, the kind with dried corn and beans and salt pork that was exactly what the cold required, and they sat at her kitchen table and ate it and talked. This was the thing that surprised him most. He had expected the gratitude and the practical exchange, and perhaps an awkward but cordial formality that would serve as the structure for whatever brief acquaintance duty required. What he had not expected was the talking. She had grown up in Missouri, she told him, on a small farm outside of Kansas City. She had 3 brothers, all older, all still back east, and a mother who had taught her to read when she was 4 and to value books when she was 8 and to be self-reliant when she was 12. She had come west with James because James had been restless in the east, and she had loved James, and love had made the geography easy to accept. She had not regretted it, she said, even now, because the land here was extraordinary, and she had found in herself a quality of endurance she might never have discovered if she had stayed on the Missouri farm. He told her about growing up in Nebraska, about his own father's cattle operation, and how he had left it to his brother when he was 22 because he needed his own land, his own work, not a portion of someone else's legacy. He told her about meeting Margaret in Cheyenne when he was 23 and she was 20, and how they had come north to build the Bishop spread from a homestead claim, and $140 in savings, and an absolute conviction on both their parts that they could do it if they were willing to work. He had not spoken Margaret's name aloud to anyone in Harrow Creek in a very long time, and it came out of him with a quality he hadn't anticipated, not the raw grief of the first year but something older and more settled, the particular ache of a wound that has healed but left a difference in the tissue. Elsie listened the way people listen when they are actually listening, not waiting for their turn but genuinely receiving what was being said, and she did not offer condolences or the meaningless formal phrases people attach to other people's grief the way they hang a decoration that doesn't quite fit the nail. She just listened, and then she said, "She sounds like she was a remarkable woman, and left room for him to say whatever he needed to or not, and he found he appreciated the quality of that space she offered enormously. He came back the following week, and the week after that. By February, he was coming twice a week and sometimes 3 times, and he had replaced 2 cracked porch boards and rehung the front gate, and repaired a leak in the kitchen ceiling that had been dripping into a pot on the counter. And each time he came there was coffee and a meal at some point in the day and conversation that ranged from the practical to the philosophical with an ease that continued to surprise him. She was reading a book about the history of ancient Rome, which she had ordered from a bookseller in Cheyenne because the general store's selection was, she said, adequate for almanacs but not for much else. She had opinions about Roman governance that she delivered with the cheerful precision of someone who had thought them through. He found he had opinions in response that he had not known he possessed, which was its own particular revelation, that a person could carry thoughts all that time without knowing they were there until someone created the conditions for them to surface. Ruth and Ada and Clara, when he brought them to town the 3rd week of February for supplies, were received in Elsie's house with a warmth that did not require any performance or adjustment. Clara went directly to Elsie and held up her arms, which was something Clara did only with people she trusted completely, and Elsie lifted her without hesitation and held her in the easy way of someone for whom that small body in her arms was entirely familiar and entirely welcome. Something about watching that exchange moved through Thomas Bishop's chest like a key turning in a lock he had not known was there. Ada, for her part, immediately demanded to know if Elsie would teach her more cornbread, and Elsie said yes with complete seriousness and took Ada into the kitchen, and Ruth stood beside her father in the parlor with the careful expression of someone trying very hard to be casual and doing a spectacular job of failing. "She is very good," Ruth said quietly. "I know it," he said. "She never had to come," Ruth said. "I asked her once in November why she kept coming. She said Clara reminded her of herself when she was small, because Clara was so determined not to be made smaller by the cold." He looked at his eldest daughter, who had her mother's eyes and her father's jaw and 3 years of burdens on her 12-year-old shoulders, and he put his arm around her. She leaned against him with a relief that broke his heart a little, because it told him how much she had been trying to carry without leaning. "She is coming to dinner Sunday," he said, "if you will have her." Ruth pulled back and looked at him with an expression he was not prepared for, equal parts surprise and hope and something much older than 12. "Yes," she said, with a careful calm that cost her something. "I think that would be very nice, Papa." The Sunday dinner was a disaster in the most endearing possible way. Ada burned the first batch of biscuits because she was trying to do too many things at once, and the stove ran hot. Clara knocked over a pitcher of water and burst into immediate tears, not from guilt, but because she had genuinely wanted the water to stay upright and was offended by physics. The gravy was too thin and then, in Ruth's attempt to correct it, too thick. And through all of this Elsie moved through the kitchen with a steady good humor that had no performance in it, catching things before they fell, talking Clara through the physics of water and gravity in a way that turned tears to interest, tasting the gravy and adding flour with a confident hand, while explaining to Ruth exactly what she was doing, and why so that it was a lesson rather than a correction. Thomas stood in the kitchen doorway and watched it all and felt something cracking open in him. He had not realized how quiet his house was until this moment of comparative noise. He had not realized that he had normalized the particular silence of 4 people working hard to keep grief at bay, the muted, careful quality of a home that had been managing rather than living. Elsie's presence in his kitchen filled something he had been trying not to notice was empty. After dinner, when Ada had fallen asleep in her chair and Clara was drowsing against Elsie's side on the settee, and Ruth was washing dishes with the careful focus she gave everything, he and Elsie sat near the hearth and talked in low voices so as not to wake anyone. "You have a fine family," she said. "They need more than I have known how to give them," he said, more honest than he usually permitted himself to be. She looked at him. "You give them safety and constancy," she said. "You give them a home that stays standing and work that has purpose. Those are not small things." "But you give them warmth," he said, and he meant it in every possible sense, and he could see that she understood the full weight of what he was saying because something shifted in her expression, a careful reserve giving way to something more unguarded. "Thomas," she said, and it was the first time she had used his given name. "Elsie," he said. They looked at each other across the hearth fire with Clara asleep between them and Ruth humming something low and tuneless in the kitchen, and the winter pressed against the house from outside with all its usual malice, and inside it was warm. He rode home that night through a sky full of stars so cold and bright they looked like they had been struck into the darkness rather than placed there. And he rode thinking about amber-brown eyes, and the way a woman who had spent 2 years being quietly, devastatingly alone, could move through a strange kitchen with that kind of ease and warmth and generosity. And he thought about Ruth's expression when he had mentioned the Sunday dinner invitation, that complicated hope. And he thought about Clara in Elsie's arms and Ada in Elsie's kitchen, and Elsie in his parlor like she had always been there, and only the circumstances of geography had delayed her arrival. He thought about all of this, and then he did something he had not done in 3 years. He made a decision about his heart. He went back to town on a Tuesday, without the girls, and he knocked on Elsie Townsend's door in the early afternoon, when the sun was doing its pale winter best against the snow. And when she opened the door, he took off his hat and he said, with the direct simplicity of a man who has thought a thing all the way through and arrived at certainty, "I would like to court you properly, if you are willing." She stood in her doorway and looked at him for a long moment, and he could see her working through something, her own resistance, her own carefully maintained self-sufficiency, the practical calculations of a widow who had built a sustainable solitude and knew how easy it was to damage it by reaching for something uncertain. "I am not an easy man," he said quietly. "I work too hard and I talk too little, and I am still finding my way back from a grief that took more out of me than I showed anyone. I have 3 daughters who need more than they have been getting. I am not offering you a simple life." "I know all of that," she said. "I have known all of that since November." "I'm also," he said, "the kind of man who, once he has decided something, is very decided, and I have decided that you are someone I want very much to know better." She was quiet for another moment, and then she stepped back from the door in the gesture that meant come in, and he did, and she said, "I will have coffee." "I know you will," he said, and he smiled, which was an expression that still felt slightly unfamiliar on his face but was, he noticed, becoming easier. He began courting her in the way of the time and place, which meant deliberate and witnessed and unhurried, with the small ceremonies of calling and escorted walks and Sunday dinners, and church on alternate Sundays when he could leave the ranch in Burl's capable hands. The town of Harrow Creek noted this development with the thorough attention that small towns apply to the romantic proceedings of their residents, and opinion was varied. Doc Emmett Price, who had delivered all 3 of Thomas's daughters and patched him up after a fence wire incident in 1877, said it was about damn time on both counts, and made this opinion known in the saloon with a cheerfulness that Thomas was fairly certain was not entirely medicinal. Helen Birch, who ran the boarding house and had a deep investment in the personal lives of everyone in Harrow Creek, said that Elsie Townsend was a lovely woman, but that a man with 3 children was a great deal to take on, and she hoped the poor thing knew what she was getting into, which Ruth reported to Thomas with the air of someone who found adult social maneuvering both transparent and tedious. Old Holt Briggs, who had been checking on the girls every 10 days all winter with an admirable if occasionally forgetful diligence, shook Thomas's hand when he saw him in March, and said Mrs. Townsend had brought soup to his place twice during January when his back had gone out, which Thomas had not known, and which added a further dimension to his already considerable respect for her. March arrived, and with it the first tentative signs that winter was willing, grudgingly, to loosen its grip on Harrow Creek. The creek at the south edge of town began to make sounds beneath its ice, the particular subterranean rushing of water that had been waiting patiently since November. The days stretched themselves a few minutes longer at each end. The horses stood differently at the rails, less hunched, beginning to remember what it felt like to have the sun do something useful. It was on one of those March days, when the temperature had climbed above freezing for the first time in months, and the icicles along the eaves were dripping in a steady, cheerful percussion, that Thomas rode into town with all three girls in the wagon and Burl driving, because Thomas wanted his hands free and his attention undivided. And he had something in his coat pocket that had been there since the previous Tuesday when he had ridden to Cheyenne and back in a single very long day. He found Elsie in her garden, which was not yet a garden but a plot of brown earth beginning to show the most optimistic edges of crocus tips at the border where she had planted bulbs in September. She was standing in the thin March sunshine with her face tilted up to it, and her eyes closed, absorbing it the way people do who have genuinely been cold for a very long time and need to remind themselves that warmth exists and is returnable. He stepped down from the wagon and told Burl to take the girls to the dry goods store and get them each a piece of penny candy. Ada's whoop could be heard until the wagon rounded the corner. He walked up to the garden gate which he had fixed in January and rested his forearms on the top rail and looked at Elsie Townsend standing in the early spring sunshine with her eyes closed. "You look like you are conducting negotiations with the sun," he said. She opened her eyes and smiled at him, a full, unguarded smile that made the winter seem like something that had happened in another story. "I may be," she said. "I have a list of conditions. Does the sun know about the fence?" "The sun has many responsibilities. I try not to burden it with the details." She came toward the gate and he opened it for her and she walked through and they stood close together in the sunshine on the edge of her not-yet garden. And he looked at her for a moment in the particular way he had developed over the winter, the way that contained everything he had been thinking and had not quite yet found the exact right sequence of words for. "Elsie," he said. "Thomas," she said, and her voice was soft. "I have been coming to your door since January," he said, "and you have been to my house more times than I can count beginning before I even knew to be grateful for it. I have had more honest conversation with you in the past 2 months than I have had with any person in the past 3 years. My daughters consider you well. Clara considers you something in the neighborhood of an angel, which I think is her most accurate character assessment to date. And Ada wants to know if she can call you by your first name, because she finds it inefficient to say Mrs. Townsend when she wants your attention quickly, which is always." He paused. "And Ruth told me last week that she has been praying since November that I would not be too stubborn to notice something good when it was right in front of me." Elsie's eyes were bright. "Ruth is a very perceptive girl," she said. "She is," he agreed. "She has her mother's clarity." He reached into his coat pocket and took out the small box he had been carrying since Cheyenne. "I went to Cheyenne last Tuesday," he said. She looked at the box. She looked at him. "I know this is soon," he said, "by some measures, and I know what I am asking you to take on, and I have no interest in pretending it is simple. But I have done a great deal of thinking this winter, and it is the clearest thinking I have done in 3 years, and the clearest thing in all of it is you." He opened the box. The ring inside was not extravagant, a plain gold band with a single small garnet, the color of deep red autumn leaves, because he had looked at the rings in the jeweler's case, and this one had reminded him of her in a way he could not articulate but was entirely sure about. "I would like very much for you to be my wife," he said, "if you will have me." She looked at the ring for a long moment, and then she looked at him. And what was in her face was not the careful, measured quality she often maintained, but something he had only glimpsed in unguarded moments before now, something full and open and entirely without defense. "That child in there," she said quietly, and she gestured toward the south in the direction of his ranch, where Clara was presumably in a wagon eating penny candy with her sisters, "is not the only one who owes you a debt of honesty." She stepped closer to him, close enough that he could see the sunlight doing particular things to the auburn in her hair. "I did not come to your house every day because I had the time," she said. "I came because I wanted to. Because those girls needed someone. And because from the one time I had seen you in 3 years, I thought you were the kind of man who would hate knowing they had needed someone and not been tended to. And I thought if I could help them through the winter, then, when you came home, you would at least not have that to carry." She stopped. "And then I met them, all three of them, and Clara with her cough and her absolute refusal to let it slow her down, and Ada with her opinions, and Ruth with her impossible quiet competence. And I fell in love with them before I let myself think about what that meant in relation to you." He was very still, looking at her. "I should have told you that from the beginning," she said. "But it felt complicated to explain, and I was not entirely certain of the exact nature of my own feelings, until you came to my door in January with that quilt and your hat in your hand and said thank you as if it was the most inadequate word you had ever spoken." "It was," he said. "I know," she said. And she reached out and took the ring from the box and placed it on her own left hand with a quiet certainty that was entirely characteristic of her, and looked at it for a moment and looked up at him. "Yes," she said, "I will marry you, Thomas Bishop." He had prepared, in the way of a practical man, several possible responses to this moment, depending on the direction it went. What actually happened was that he stepped forward and put his hands carefully on both sides of her face, and kissed her in the March sunshine beside her not-yet garden, with the icicles dripping from the eaves and the crocus tips showing at the border. And she kissed him back with a warmth and thoroughness that made several months of patient courtship feel like they had been leading to exactly and only this. When they separated, he was holding her hands and she was smiling, and he thought he probably was too, which was still slightly unfamiliar but considerably less so than it had been in January. "The girls," he said. "The girls will be insufferable about it," she said. "Ada will claim she knew first. Clara will be unsurprised, and Ruth will cry and pretend she is not." He laughed. It was a real laugh, full and unguarded, and it surprised him slightly by how natural it felt. "That is a very accurate prediction," he said. He went and brought the wagon back and helped the three of them down, and they came in a cluster through the garden gate, Ada already talking about the peppermint she had gotten at the dry goods store and the very important opinions she had formed about it, and Clara toddling along behind her with something sticky on her chin. Ruth came last, with her careful eyes moving between her father and Elsie and the way they were standing, and he watched her expression arrive at understanding, and then do exactly what Elsie had predicted, which was fill with tears that she immediately tried to make appear to be something other than tears. "Mrs. Townsend is going to be your stepmother," Thomas said to his daughters. "If that is agreeable to you." Ada said, "Can I call her Elsie?" with the air of someone who has been waiting for the answer to this question for some time. Clara walked directly to Elsie and held up her arms again, which was her standard and complete statement of approval on all subjects. Ruth stood very still for a moment and then said, in a voice that was admirably level considering everything it was working against, "Yes, Papa. That is very agreeable to us." And then she gave up on the levelness and hugged Elsie with the full force of 12 years old and 3 years of holding too much alone. And Elsie held her back with one arm and Clara with the other, and looked at Thomas over the tops of their heads with an expression that he thought he would be seeing in his memory for the rest of his life. They were married in June of 1879, on a Saturday afternoon when the prairie south of Harrow Creek was green in that brief, vivid way it managed each year before the summer heat turned it gold, with the Laramie Range blue and sharp against the sky to the west. Reverend Cole performed the ceremony on the porch of the church because the day was too fine to spend indoors, and the whole of Harrow Creek turned out in the way of a small town that treats its neighbors' significant events as community occasions requiring their full participation. Elsie wore a dress she had made herself in the weeks before the wedding, a pale gray-green that suited her coloring in a way that made Doc Price tell Thomas he was a lucky man with a directness that Thomas found both accurate and slightly unnecessary, since he was already aware of it. Ruth stood as witness with her mother's cameo brooch pinned to her collar. Ada stood beside Ruth and managed to remain reasonably still through most of the ceremony, which everyone privately agreed was an achievement. Clara stood between her two sisters and held a bunch of wildflowers she had picked that morning from the field behind the church with such focus and intensity that the flowers were slightly the worse for wear by the time the ceremony began. But she held them with absolute gravity, and that was more than enough. Thomas said his vows in the straight, clear way he did everything important, looking at Elsie with the full weight of his attention. Elsie said hers with a steadiness that only broke for a single moment near the end, and when it did she did not look away from him, and he did not look away from her, and the slight tremor in her voice was the most honest thing either of them had offered the other, which was saying something given the honesty they had managed all winter and spring. Doc Price, standing in the front row, was seen to blow his nose vigorously into a handkerchief at this juncture. Helen Birch from the boarding house wept openly and unashamedly, apparently having revised her earlier reservations about the whole enterprise, as people sometimes do when faced with the conclusive evidence of the thing itself. Holt Briggs shook Thomas's hand after and said gruffly that he was glad someone was finally taking proper care of the Bishop household, which Thomas understood as the warmest thing Holt was capable of saying, and received it accordingly. The celebration that followed in the churchyard, with tables of food brought by half the town and music provided by two fiddles and a man with a jaw harp who played with more enthusiasm than accuracy, but made up for the latter with sheer commitment, lasted until well past sundown. Elsie danced with all three of Thomas's daughters in turn, Ada with the focused competitive spirit of someone who has been studying dancing for precisely this purpose, Clara with the gleeful absolute disregard for anything resembling rhythm that 5-year-olds bring to all physical activities, and Ruth with a careful grace that she had been practicing without mentioning it to anyone. Thomas danced with Elsie once, a slow waltz when the fiddlers found a more measured tempo in the cooling evening air, and he held her with the careful reverence of a man who has recently discovered that he is still capable of tenderness and is not entirely sure what to do with that discovery other than act on it, which he did. Happy, he said, because he needed to know. She looked up at him with the full, uncomplicated warmth that he had first properly seen in her eyes back in March on the edge of her garden. Completely, she said. They moved Elsie's things to the ranch in the first week after the wedding, which was a project of considerable scale, given that a good portion of those things were books. Thomas built an additional shelf unit in the parlor, and she arranged her books on it with a systematic care that Ada found fascinating and assisted with at great length, which mostly meant rearranging things Elsie had already placed and then being gently redirected. But the spirit of collaboration was genuine, and the result was a parlor that had more books in it than Thomas had ever expected to own, but which, he was discovering, he was entirely glad to have. The ceramic cups with the rose pattern went into the kitchen cupboard alongside his own chipped tin ones, and he looked at them one morning in the early weeks of July while getting coffee and thought about January and her doorway and how far everything had traveled since then, and felt a gratitude so specific and particular it had its own weight in his chest, like something placed there with care and left to stay. She took over Clara's treatment with the organized dedication of someone who had been studying the child's constitution all winter and had a clear plan. She continued the eucalyptus salve through the summer. She made sure Clara spent mornings in the fresh air when the weather allowed. She corresponded with a doctor in Cheyenne whom Doc Price had recommended, a specialist in childhood respiratory ailments, and followed his suggestions about diet and activity with meticulous attention. Clara's cough did not disappear. It was the kind of cough that had been with her from birth and would likely be her companion into adulthood. But under Elsie's care it stayed in its lane, manageable and monitored, rather than the frightening, rattling thing it became when cold and neglect combined against it. Ruth, who had been operating for 3 years as the household's second adult, discovered over the course of that summer what it felt like to be 12 again. It was a revelation of some complexity, because she had not realized how much of herself she had compressed into her adult role until she had room to expand back out of it. Elsie managed this with a particular sensitivity, because she understood, without needing it explained, the exact nature of what Ruth had been carrying and the delicacy required in setting it down. She did not simply take over. She came alongside Ruth and shared the responsibilities and slowly, gradually, shifted them until Ruth was contributing as a child does, meaningfully but not at the cost of childhood. One August evening, Thomas came in from the barn to find Ruth sitting at the kitchen table with one of Elsie's books open in front of her. Reading. Just reading. In the uncomplicated way of a person who has nothing more pressing to do. And he stopped in the doorway and looked at his oldest daughter reading a book in the summer evening with the lamplight on her face. And the feeling that moved through him then was a specific and uncomplicated joy that he had not felt since before Margaret died. Ada, for her part, took to Elsie with the wholehearted enthusiasm she brought to all things that engaged her competitive instincts, which in this case meant that she was determined to be the best student Elsie had ever taught, which was somewhat awkward since Elsie was not formally her teacher but had, in the natural course of their daily life together, become the person who answered most of Ada's endless questions about everything. Ada's questions were wide-ranging and relentless. They covered topics as varied as the chemical properties of lye soap, the political situation in Washington with respect to the territorial government, why horses were different colors, whether ancient Romans had eaten anything interesting, and what exactly happened to James Townsend on the mountain road, which Ada asked once with the direct simplicity of a child who had not yet learned why adults considered some questions impolite. Elsie answered that last one with a steadiness that impressed Thomas, who happened to be within earshot. She said James had been a good man who had worked hard and loved her well and died doing the kind of work that men in the West did every day, and that the mountains were beautiful and unforgiving, and that was simply their nature. She said she missed him and that missing people was part of how love worked. It did not stop when the person did. It just changed its form. Ada received this with the solemn attentiveness she gave things she was genuinely trying to understand, and then she asked whether ancient Romans had mourned people the way they did, and Elsie said yes, and offered to show her a passage in one of her books, and that was that. Thomas held his wife that night on the porch in the dark after the girls were asleep, standing behind her with his arms around her and her head back against his shoulder, looking at the Wyoming sky doing its full summer performance above them, and he said, "Ada asked you about James today." "She did," Elsie said. "You answered well," he said. "She needed a real answer," she said simply. "Children always know when they are being given a polished version instead of the real one." He pressed his mouth to the top of her head. "You are very good with them," he said, "all 3 of them." She turned in his arms to look at him. "They are very good to be good with," she said. "They are remarkable children." "They are Margaret's children," he said, and then, with the careful honesty that had become the language of their marriage, "And they are yours now too, in every way that matters." She put her hand on the side of his face with a gentleness that was entirely characteristic and kissed him once softly, and then turned back to look at the stars, and they stood there together on the porch of the Bishop Ranch for a long time in the summer dark while the prairie sang its night songs around them. The summer moved into autumn and autumn into the second winter, And this winter arrived at the Bishop Ranch to find it entirely altered from the one that had nearly swallowed Clara 2 years before. The house was warmer, partly because Thomas had spent September adding insulation to the walls, with the focused energy of a man who has spent time thinking about what his house lacked and intends to address every item on the list, and partly because Elsie had immediately, upon her arrival in June, assessed the house's weaknesses with the critical eye of someone who had spent a winter compensating for them, and had specific, actionable opinions about what needed to change. The firewood was stacked deep and well seasoned. The kitchen had been reorganized so that the cooking was more efficient, and the heat it generated circulated better through the connecting rooms. There were new quilts on all the beds, including a particularly fine one that Elsie had made during the late summer evenings, a pattern of interlocking stars in the deep red and blue and gold that she seemed to favor, large enough for the bed she shared with Thomas, and thick enough to hold warmth against anything Wyoming cared to send. Clara went into that winter with the best health she had managed in her 5 years of life. She was growing, which was not something she had done with great enthusiasm in her earliest years, and her color was good and her energy was the bounding, relentless energy of a healthy child who has been given the foundation she needed. She still coughed. She always would. But it was her cough, managed and monitored, not a threat but a fact, one of the particular facts of Clara Bishop's particular life. That winter Elsie told Thomas in early December that she was expecting a child. She told him quietly, in the kitchen in the early morning before the girls were awake, sitting across from him at the table with both hands wrapped around her coffee cup, and she watched his face with an expression he recognized as the careful measuring one she used when she was uncertain of a response and preparing herself for multiple possibilities. What she got was Thomas Bishop setting down his coffee cup with the kind of deliberate care a man uses when he needs his hands to be still, standing up from the table, walking around it, and taking her face in both his hands and looking at her with everything he had in the full weight of his gray eyes. "Truly," he said. "Truly," she said, and her voice was slightly unsteady. He kissed her forehead and then both her cheeks and then her mouth and then her forehead again, and held her against his chest with a tenderness that said more than any articulation he might have attempted, and she put her arms around him and held on with that fierce, quiet grip that was one of his favorite things about her. "A baby," he said into her hair. "A baby," she confirmed, her voice muffled by his shirt. "In summer," he said. "June or thereabouts," she said. He pulled back to look at her face. She was smiling now, the full smile that went all the way through, and her eyes were bright. "Are you happy?" she said, which was an interesting reversal of his June question to her. "I am entirely happy," he said, with the simple certainty that was his native language in all things he was sure about, and she laughed, a real laugh of relief and delight, and kissed him again. They told the girls at dinner. Clara was perhaps the youngest person in human history to receive news of an impending sibling with the particular philosophical calm of someone who has already considered the situation and made peace with it. Ruth cried again, and this time did not attempt any subterfuge about it. Ada immediately began a comprehensive assessment of the practical implications, including questions about sleeping arrangements and what the baby would be allowed to touch, and whether it would be permitted to go through her things, all of which were addressed with varying degrees of success. The winter passed in the full warmth of a house that knew how to be won. Elsie continued the domestic improvements she had begun in summer, teaching Ruth to preserve food beyond just the salt and smoke methods Thomas had been using, teaching Ada to bake with considerably more consistent results, and teaching Clara a version of letters and numbers that Clara engaged with at speed, and with a competitive ferocity that suggested her future teachers were in for an interesting time. Thomas found that being a married man again was a different thing the second time, not diminished by comparison but deepened by it. He knew what he had in a way he had not known at 23, knew the specific and irreplaceable quality of a person who chose to be beside you every day, and did not make that choice lightly. He was more present than he had been with Margaret in their early years, more attentive to the texture of the ordinary days, because he had spent 3 years understanding what it cost to lose it. He also found that Elsie had something he had not entirely anticipated, a quality of joy in small things that was not naivety but its absolute opposite. A woman who knew what hard things felt like, and therefore paid the kind of attention to good things that they deserved. She was delighted by the first crocus in her garden in March. She was genuinely moved by a sunset she watched from the porch in late February. She read aloud from her books in the evening sometimes, and the particular pleasure she took in the language of a well-crafted sentence was infectious in a way that had Ruth, and sometimes even Ada, listening past their bedtimes. Spring came earlier than the year before, or seemed to, perhaps because they were all watching for it with a more specific attention. The creek thawed in late March, rushing and brown with snowmelt, and the prairie began its tentative greening. The bluffs to the north showed the particular change in color that meant the ice on the north faces was releasing. In April, Burl Mackey came to Thomas with news from a neighboring ranch about a band of Arapaho families who had been moving through the area, displaced by the continued encroachment on their territory and looking for safe passage south. This was the ongoing reality of the Wyoming Territory in 1879, the brutal, systematic displacement of indigenous people from land they had occupied for generations, driven by treaty violations and military pressure, and the relentless westward push of settlers. Thomas had views on this that were more nuanced than many of his neighbors, influenced by years of watching the practical effects of these policies play out in the land around him, and by Elsie's books and the conversations they generated. He spoke to Burl about leaving the south pasture gate open for passage, and leaving some provision at the fence line, which Burl received with the stoic practicality of a man who had his own complex relationship with the question, but trusted his employer's judgment. He mentioned this to Elsie that evening, and she looked at him with the quiet, measuring expression that meant she was both agreeing and extending the thought. "The Reverend was saying last Sunday that there are families camped in the canyon south of Briggs Creek," she said. "Some of them have been ill." "I heard that," he said. "I have supplies I could bring," she said, and her hand moved briefly to her rounded abdomen because she was 5 months along, and even Elsie Townsend could not pretend the gesture was neutral. It was both offer and acknowledgement of her current limits. "I will bring them," he said. "You will tell me what to take and write down what the doctor in Cheyenne said about the respiratory illness that's been going around, and I will take them." She looked at him steadily. "You are a good man, Thomas Bishop," she said. "You are a good woman, Elsie Bishop," he said, and he meant it with the full weight of everything it contained, the history of the name she had worn before his, the winter she had spent keeping his children warm, the way she had come to his house every day with soup and salve, and the warm, patient presence that had held his family together while he was gone, and the way she had taken everything he was and built something real with it. She put her book down and crossed the room and sat beside him on the settee and took his hand, and he brought it to his mouth and kissed her knuckles, and they sat together in the lamplight with the Wyoming spring pressing against the windows. He made the trip south with the provisions in May, and came back with the uncomplicated quiet of a man who has done a small useful thing and does not require acknowledgement for it. Elsie did not make more of it than it was, but she tucked her arm into his when he came through the door, and the look she gave him was the full, warm, unguarded one, and that was enough for both of them. June arrived in that particular burst of green and warmth that Wyoming spring allowed, as if making up for the length of its delay with an intensity of color and a quality of air that was the best argument the landscape could make for itself. The Laramie Range turned blue and clear and snow-capped above a foreground of prairie grass and wildflowers, and the creek ran clear and full, and the day that Elsie Bishop delivered her child was exactly the kind of day that made the difficult one seem, temporarily, like they had been in service of this. It was a boy. He arrived in the early morning of the 14th of June, attended by Doc Price and Ruth, who had positioned herself as a necessary presence and been deemed by the doctor to have earned that right. He was large for a first child, with a surprisingly strong voice about the general situation, which he communicated in detail to everyone present. He had Thomas's dark hair and Elsie's eyes, amber brown and wide, and already carrying that specific quality of attention, as if he had arrived already interested in what the world was going to offer. Thomas held him in the early morning with the light coming through the bedroom window and Elsie watching from the pillow with the exhausted, radiant quality of a woman who has done the hardest work she has ever done and knows it. And he held his son with the same careful reverence he had held Elsie on their wedding day. And he did not say anything for a long time because there was nothing that needed to be said. Clara climbed onto the bed and pressed her face against her stepmother's shoulder and looked at the baby with 5-year-old solemnity. "He is very loud," she said. "He is," Elsie agreed. "I was loud," Clara said. "You were," Thomas confirmed. "We are a loud family," Ada said from the doorway, with the satisfaction of someone who has identified a defining characteristic and finds it accurate. Ruth stood at the foot of the bed with her careful eyes and her mother's cameo at her throat and her father's jaw, and 3 years of hard roads behind her and a whole future ahead of her. And she looked at her father holding his son and her stepmother in the bed with Clara against her shoulder and Ada in the doorway counting the baby's fingers out loud. And she said, very quietly, "Hello," to the baby. And the baby, as if hearing specifically her voice, turned his head in that unfocused way of the very new and moved his mouth. Thomas looked at his wife. "James," he said, "for what was good in him if you are willing?" Elsie's breath caught just slightly and then steadied, and she looked at her husband with that wide-open expression, the one without any guards at all. "James Thomas," she said, "for both of them." He nodded once, the way he said yes to things he was entirely certain about. "James Thomas Bishop," he said to his son, and the baby responded with the comprehensive indifference of the newly arrived. The summer rolled out in long, warm days, and the ranch took on the quality that Thomas had been reaching for, not knowingly but certainly, since Margaret died. A working life that was also a lived one. The mornings had noise in them again, the particular morning noise of a full house, Ada's opinions, Clara's questions, the baby's instructions about the universe, Ruth's quiet movement through it all, and Elsie at the center of it with that unshakable warmth, making breakfast and nursing James Thomas and answering questions and drinking coffee with Thomas on the porch in those 10 minutes before the day fully claimed them both. Burl Mackey, who was not a sentimental man, told Thomas that November that the ranch had a different feel to it than it had the previous 3 years. Thomas asked him to elaborate. Burl thought about it for a while and said it felt like a place people wanted to be instead of a place they were enduring. Thomas said yes, he supposed that was right. He went and found Elsie in the kitchen where she was making preserves with Clara's vigorous and only partially useful assistance, and he stood in the doorway and looked at her for a moment because he still did that, still stopped and looked, and she felt him looking and glanced up and smiled. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said. "Just looking." "You do that a great deal," she said. "I know," he said. "I have reason to." She rolled her eyes at him, but the smile stayed, and Clara said, "Papa, come help. We are running out of hands," which was both literally true and the best possible commentary on the general state of the Bishop household, where there was always more warmth than hands could hold and more love than anyone had originally known to plan for. He went in and helped. The winter of 1879 moved into 1880, and the second winter of their marriage was entirely unlike the first winter Elsie had spent in Harrow Creek, alone in her small house on the north end of the main street. There was no question of loneliness or of quiet winters. The Bishop Ranch in December was warm and populated and purposeful. James Thomas, who was 6 months old and had opinions about everything that could be communicated through the volume and timbre of vocal expression, was a constant presence and a constant source of the particular joy that only small babies in their first winter generate, which is a miraculous combination of exhaustion and delight that parents of all eras will recognize as one of the stranger gifts of the experience. Clara's second winter under Elsie's care was markedly better than the one that had preceded it, and better even than the summer, because the routine they had established was operating in full now. The salve, the fresh air and the gentler cold, the careful attention to diet, the doctor's letters followed with diligence. Clara did not merely survive the winter, she thrived in it. She was growing into a child of considerable character, combining her mother Margaret's dark lashes and determined spirit with a quality of observation that was entirely her own, and that Elsie spent time cultivating, because she recognized in it something rare and worth developing. Ada turned 10 in the spring of 1880 and announced that she would like to be a doctor. This was a declaration received by the family with varying degrees of equanimity. Thomas said if she worked for it there was no reason she could not. Ruth said it would require a great deal of schooling. Clara said she thought Ada should be a doctor because Ada was already very good at telling people what was wrong with them. Elsie said she had books about medicine and anatomy that Ada could begin with, and she got them out that same afternoon. And Ada went through the first 50 pages with an intensity of focus that would not have surprised the Roman senators she had previously studied with similar dedication. That spring Thomas expanded the ranch, buying the adjacent 40 acres from Holt Briggs, who was getting older and whose back had not recovered its former reliability, and who was quietly relieved to reduce his operation. The expansion meant more work, which meant more men, and Burrell took on the coordination of the new hands with the slightly alarmed competence of a man who has been offered more responsibility and is not entirely sure he wanted it but is too professional to decline. Elsie, who had maintained her garden through the first full year at the ranch, now expanded it to use the additional south-facing ground near the kitchen door, and what had been a modest kitchen garden became something more ambitious, a thing of real productivity and also of real beauty, with the vegetable rows and the herb beds and a border of flowers that served no practical purpose whatsoever except to be exactly what the house needed at its front, which was evidence of someone who had time to plant beautiful things and did. Thomas built her a proper garden fence that summer, solid and level, and with a gate that latched properly on the first try, and she walked around it and ran her hand along the top rail and said it was the best fence she had ever had, and he said it was the best fence he had ever built, and both of these statements were exactly true. He also, that summer, made good on something he had been thinking about since March of 1879. He rode to Cheyenne on business in July and came back with a leather-bound journal, blank inside, good quality paper, the kind that held ink without bleeding. He gave it to Ruth, who looked at it without immediately understanding. "You think in sentences," he said. "I have watched you do it for years. You organize things in your mind before you speak them. Your stepmother does the same thing and she has books and a journal both. I think you ought to have the same." Ruth held the journal with both hands and looked at her father. "You don't have to," he said, "if you would rather something else." "No," she said, with the decisive clarity she shared with both her parents. "No, this is exactly right." She pressed it against her chest for a moment in the unconscious way of a person receiving something that fits a need they hadn't known how to name. "Thank you, Papa," he nodded. "Write something good," he said. She did that same evening, sitting by the lamplight in the parlor, while James Thomas slept in the cradle beside her, and Ada debated ancient Roman agriculture with Elsie across the table, and Clara drew pictures of horses on the back of an envelope. Thomas sat in the chair across from his oldest daughter and watched her write and thought about Margaret, who had also kept a journal, 3 of them, still in the box under the bed, and thought about how grief worked, not as a replacement but as an accumulation. Not Margaret replaced by Elsie, but Margaret where she was, and Elsie where she was, and both of them real and both of them part of what he was, and the life he was living now containing everything that had brought him to it. Loss and hope and winter and spring, and a knock on a woman's door in January with a quilt folded over his saddle, and nothing like adequate words. The autumn of 1880 arrived with a more manageable temperament than the one 2 years prior, or perhaps the Bishop family was simply better equipped for it, which amounted to the same thing. The woodpile was enormous. The root cellar was full. The horses were well shod, and the cattle in the best condition Thomas had managed in 6 years of running the operation. Burl had found his footing with the expanded crew, and the ranch was running with a smoothness that allowed Thomas to spend more of his time on the things that mattered more directly. He spent more evenings on the porch with his wife. He spent more mornings at the kitchen table with all 4 of his children and a cup of coffee, listening to Ada conduct whatever inquiry she was currently pursuing, watching Clara draw, watching Ruth develop opinions about the books she was beginning to work through on the parlor shelf, bouncing James Thomas on his knee with the unself-conscious ease of a man who has remembered how to do this, how to be present in the ordinary moments rather than passing through them on the way to the next practical task. One October evening, with the aspen on the creek turning gold and the air carrying that particular scent of coming winter mixed with the last of the autumn warmth, Thomas and Elsie sat on the porch after the children were in bed, and the sky above the ranch was doing its full performance, that incomprehensible depth of stars that the Wyoming dark made possible. "Do you ever miss your house in town?" he said. She considered it genuinely, which was her way. "Sometimes," she said. "I miss the proximity of the library. I miss being able to walk to the dry goods store. I miss Mrs. Hernandez at the end of the street who grew the most extraordinary tomatoes and always brought some over." "I can build you a greenhouse," he said. She laughed. "You cannot build me a greenhouse." "I can build you a very small greenhouse," he said. "I have been thinking about it since July." She looked at him sideways. "You have been thinking about a greenhouse since July? You can grow tomatoes in a greenhouse," he said. "Year-round, if the design is right. I have been reading about it." She turned to look at him fully. "You have been reading about greenhouse design?" "In the evenings," he said. "You gave me the idea when you mentioned it would be nice to have tomatoes in winter. I have been thinking about it since." She looked at him for a long moment with that full, open expression, the one that still sometimes undid him entirely, and said, "Thomas Bishop, you are the most quietly extraordinary man I have ever met." He felt the back of his neck get warm in the way it did when she said things like that, which was a phenomenon he had not experienced since his 20s. "I am a practical man," he said. "You like tomatoes." "I love you," she said, simply and entirely. He put his arm around her and she tucked herself against his side, and the stars overhead did what stars do, which is to say they continued their long and patient business entirely indifferent to human affairs, but somehow making everything more meaningful by their presence. And the ranch was quiet around them, warm and inhabited and full of sleeping children, and the particular peace that comes from a life that has been built rather than merely occupied. "I love you," he said, into her hair. "I have loved you since January when I came to your door with that quilt, and you told me to come in out of the cold, because a conversation in a doorway was no kind of conversation. And probably before that, if I am honest, but January is when I began to understand what I was looking at." She pressed closer against him. "I loved you since November," she said. "Since Ruth's letter said you had been delayed by snow and you hadn't written the girls yourself because you didn't want to worry them. I thought, what kind of man thinks about that in a blizzard? And then I thought, the kind of man worth coming back to." He held her for a while in the October night and thought about the sequence of small accidents and choices that had arrived at this porch, this night, this woman beside him. The cattle drive that ran long, the blizzard in the Powder River country, Clara's cough. A widow with flower on her wrist and amber eyes and a quilt in a blue and gold pattern. All of it leading here, to a man who had been carrying his grief like a second skin for 3 years until someone quietly, without being asked, and without knowing he was watching, came every day to his house and kept his daughter warm, and in doing so, did something inexorable to the walls around his heart. The child that is not the only one who owes you, he thought, and he thought it with the warmth of a man whose debt is one he is entirely glad to owe. He had said those exact words to her, back in March, standing on the edge of her garden in the pale spring sunshine. He had said that Clara was not the only one who owed her. He had meant it then as a statement of obligation and intention. He understood it differently now, not as a debt to be repaid, but as the particular gift of being known and chosen, and loved with the kind of love that did not wait for conditions to be perfect, or for the person to have arranged themselves into something more convenient, but came and knocked on the door in November with soup and salve, and stayed through the hard weather, and kept the fire going until he could come home to find everything warm. He had come home to find everything warm. And everything had stayed that way. The small greenhouse took Thomas 4 weeks to build, using glass panels he ordered from Cheyenne, and a cedar frame he designed himself over the course of 3 evenings at the kitchen table with a pen and paper, and Elsie's increasingly interested commentary. It went up against the south wall of the house in November, catching the winter sun with a simple efficiency that he found satisfying in the way of a practical solution to a genuine problem. Elsie planted tomato seeds in December, in small pots arranged on the cedar shelf he had built inside it. She had herbs in there too, the same hanging bundles that she had brought to his house that first November, lavender and rosemary, and the chamomile she made into tea for Clara's sleep, growing under glass while the Wyoming winter pressed its indifferent face against the outside and found less purchase than it used to. By February, the tomato seedlings were 3 inches tall and thriving. Clara came to look at them every morning with a scientific interest that she had developed alongside her affection for Elsie's garden. Ada assessed them for agricultural potential and asked 3 highly specific questions about soil chemistry that Elsie answered from memory and also from one of her books, which Ada then read in its entirety in a week. Ruth sketched them in the back of her journal, small, careful drawings of seedlings in pots on a cedar shelf, the kind of drawing that would mean more 10 years from now than it did today. James Thomas, at 8 months old, was too young to form an opinion about tomatoes, but was developing very clear opinions about being carried past the greenhouse without being allowed to bang on the glass, which Thomas resolved by bringing him inside and letting him put his hands on the small warm pots while Elsie watched with the smile she had for all such moments, the one that was entirely present in it, not performing maternal warmth but actually in it. Spring came again. It always did, in the way of things that are simply constant beneath the drama of the difficult seasons. The creek thawed, the prairie greened. The crocus border at the edge of Elsie's garden put up its small brave flags. The Laramie Range turned from its winter blue to the particular purple of very early spring before the green came down from the higher elevations. On the first real warm day of April, Thomas Bishop stood at his porch rail and looked out at his land in the morning light. The pasture was beginning to show green beneath the dead grass. The horses in the near paddock were alert in the way they got when the weather changed in the direction of warmth, ears up, moving with a new ease. The greenhouse against the south wall of the house caught the morning sun and glowed with it. Behind him, inside, he could hear Elsie at the stove and Ada and Ruth in some early morning dispute about who had used the last of the ink, which was the kind of argument that indicated everyone was adequately rested and possessed of sufficient energy for opinions, which Thomas had come to understand as the household's primary indicator of health. Clara came and stood beside him at the rail, leaning against it on her small forearms in a precise imitation of his posture, and looked out at the morning with the focused attentiveness that was one of the things he loved most about her. "It's getting warm," she said. "It is," he said. "2 springs ago," she said, in the careful way of a 7-year-old trying to navigate memory, "when I was sick all winter, Elsie came every day." "She did," he said. "I remember it," Clara said. "I remember her hands were always warm, even when it was very cold. Her hands were always warm." He looked at his youngest daughter, who was 7 years old and had Margaret's lashes and her own determined spirit and a cough that was her companion, and not her master and a stepmother who had found her in the worst winter Harrow Creek had seen in a decade, and decided, on no basis other than goodness, to keep her warm. "Yes," he said, "they were." Clara leaned against his arm and they stood together in the April morning, and behind them the door opened and Elsie came out with 2 cups of coffee, one for her and one for him, and she handed him his and stood on his other side with her face tilted up to the sun in the way she had, absorbing it. "Your tomatoes will be ready to move to the outdoor beds next month," Thomas said. "I know," she said, with the satisfaction of someone watching a long plan reach its result. "I am thinking about expanding the greenhouse," he said, "making it twice the length." She looked at him. "For what purpose?" "Whatever you want to grow in it," he said. "Roses if you want, strawberries, anything." She looked at him for a long moment. "Thomas," she said. "Elsie," he said. She took his hand, the one not holding the coffee cup, and laced her fingers through his and looked back out at the April morning. Clara was already off the porch and running toward the garden to check on the crocus border, her small figure in her blue coat moving through the pale spring light with the unstoppable energy of a healthy child who has somewhere to go. Inside, Ada's argument with Ruth had apparently been resolved, and something that might have been laughter was coming through the open door. James Thomas was awake and making his standard morning announcement about the general situation, which was vigorous and informative, and told by its very volume that he was entirely well. Elsie tightened her fingers around Thomas's, and he tightened his around hers, and they stood on the porch of the ranch they had built together from the winter wreckage of 2 separate losses, looking out at their land in the first real warmth of another Wyoming spring, and neither of them needed to say anything at all. Everything that needed to be said had been said already, back in a March garden and a January doorway, and a November kitchen that smelled of herbs and beeswax and eucalyptus, in every cup of coffee that had been an invitation, and every knock on a door that had been an answer, and every day she had ridden out to his house in the hard weather without being asked, keeping 3 small children warm and fed and not afraid. Until the man who loved them came home and found everything warm and understood that what he owed her was more than a fence and a gratitude and a garnet ring, that what he owed her was exactly what she had given his children, his whole and absolute presence, fully arrived, fully home, which he was, which they both were, which was, in the end, the whole of it.